When I was 8 years old, my father was diagnosed with terminal cancer, and he died a few days after my 9th birthday. One of the many effects of this in my life was that I had a lot more responsibility. I had to take a lot more responsibility in my world and in my family than I might otherwise have had to. I was born on a tree farm, and every summer there was lots of work to do in the fields and in the woods, and I didn't always like it, and I didn't always want to get up to do it, and I didn't appreciate the black flies and getting soaking wet walking out into the dewy fields first thing in the morning. But I did it. And even though when I was as young as 14 years old, I was meeting with buyers of Christmas trees. I remember a French-Canadian guy who came down with a huge wad of cash and handed me a deposit that was more money than I had ever seen in my life. And I accepted that responsibility. And as I said, I didn't always like it, but it gave me a sense of power and strength and a realization that even when really hard things happened in my life, or even when things were really challenges, there was something in me that could rise to meet this. A few years later, I decided I wanted to learn more about dairy farming. So I went over to one of our neighbors who was the best farmer I knew, the best dairy farmer I knew, and I asked if they needed help. And he said they did. And so I was hired to work 6 days a week, 14 hours a day for $80 a week. And I worked my ass off. And I was determined, even though I didn't know much about dairy farming, I was determined to show up at 5 o'clock every morning and to do the grunt jobs, raking out the calves' stalls and turning on the gutter cleaner, spreading the manure, doing whatever had to be done. And as the new guy, and maybe they sensed I was kind of eager and a sucker and could be prompted into doing things that other people didn't want to do, especially family members who lived on the farm. So the visiting health inspector had told the farmer that the ceiling in the barn needed to be cleaned. It was corrugated metal, kind of mottled metal that had been nailed onto the roof, and cows' tails sprayed manure up when they swung. So it was dirty, covered with spotted manure and cobwebs and dust and dirt and all kinds of stuff. And it was a big barn. And so my boss, the farmer, gave me a bucket and a bristle brush on the end of a stick and set me to it. And I went after it. And I went after it with a vengeance. And I worked day after day. And I'm holding this pole over my head with soapy water, and that shitty brown water would come down and run up my arms and splash in my face. And I kept at it, and I kept at it, and I kept at it. And I did maybe a third of it in one rainy day. And then I kept coming back to it whenever there was free time, whenever we weren't haying, whenever the time could be made. And I took responsibility for that, and I took pride in that, and I felt good about that. And this became part of how I met life. I said, I can't even say I exactly chose it. It's just something in me said, okay, if this is what life brings, whatever life brings, I will meet it. And that's kind of what responsibility felt like to me. And I could overdo it, and I could make mistakes, and I often did. When I discovered I had an aptitude as a counselor, I worked in a counseling organization, and I was very excited to be able to help people in deep and intimate ways. And that was very meaningful to me and very enlivening to me. And I learned a tremendous amount. But I also took on too much responsibility. I didn't understand. I was very young, and I didn't understand that you could get over-involved in people's lives. You could become too responsible. And instead of just offering help and offering attention and offering a space where people could grieve and process whatever they needed to process, I was in a kind of youthful arrogance. I was offering myself as someone who could help them all the way through this. And that was too much responsibility. And it was not a responsibility that I could or should rightfully take. But I learned from that as well. And that wasn't the biggest mistake I would make in my life, of course. If you've been listening to this channel, I made a tremendous set of mistakes, raising money for a film project at the behest of a so-called spiritual teacher who turned out to be a con man. And I raised all this money, and I worked my ass off to do this and to make the film and to fulfill the responsibility that I had taken on to repay this money to people who had trusted me. And as you know, if you've listened to other videos here, of course, it didn't work out. And something in me knew I needed to take responsibility for that. I couldn't avoid what I had done. I needed to admit the mistakes that I had made. And I learned that responsibility wasn't just taking responsibility for doing things right. It was taking responsibility for being accountable and holding yourself accountable, holding myself accountable when things went terribly wrong. And what I've seen increasingly over the course of my lifetime is that it looks like we have gotten more and more screwed up as a culture about what it means to take responsibility for our lives. On the one hand, we have kind of hardened people who say, well, if you get pregnant, it's your responsibility. You have to carry the child for life. It's a kind of fixed, rigid, judgmental way of taking responsibility. If you're poor, you're responsible for that. If your situation isn't good, you're responsible for that. Whatever it is. That's one extreme. And then we have another extreme of people, perhaps in order to counter that harshness, we have tried to say, well, there are reasons why people have a hard time taking responsibility for their lives. You can't blame somebody for a random act of violence and blame them because they're wounded or depressed or even suicidal. That's a terrible distortion of responsibility. But in a way, there's a whole segment of our culture that has functionally said, really, we're not responsible for anything. All of us are so wounded or so conditioned or so influenced and controlled consciously and unconsciously by factors that are beyond our control, that we can't really even be expected to take responsibility for our lives. And this seems like just another kind of distortion. So we have this pole of kind of hard, cruel responsibility as blame, responsibility as a cudgel, responsibility as a punishment. And then we have this kind of abdication of responsibility that says, none of these bad things should have happened to you. And so, of course, you're not responsible. You're not responsible for your addiction. You're not responsible for your life on the street. You're not responsible for the fact that it's hard for you to be present in your family because nobody was present in your family. And as I've said here, there are good things about holding people accountable, and there are good things about compassion. But it seems to me that we've kind of lost our way in a multitude of different directions. So let me just say, what the hell is responsibility? What does it mean? There are so many ways that it's been twisted and distorted into something that, in my view and in my experience, isn't truly what it is, or isn't truly the empowering, enlivening version of responsibility. So I don't exactly know how to describe it or how to define it, but I was thinking just this morning that, in a way, responsibility is simply the willingness to meet life exactly as it is in every given moment. If something is called for in your life, if there's a step that you need to take, if there's something that you need to face or something that you need to do you take the stance, or do you meet life in a way where you do whatever it is that's in front of you? And it can be anything. It can be making a big change in your life. It can be stepping into someone else's life and offering help at a critical place and at a critical juncture in their life. Responsibility can also be saying, no, I'm responsible to myself. I can't help this person. I'm responsible first for my own well-being, for my own existence, for walking the walk of my own life. I can't bear the responsibility or the burden of carrying the weight of someone who doesn't want to carry their own weight, of being in a relationship that isn't working for me any longer. So, excuse me, responsibility is not a fixed term. It's not an absolute. It is a way of meeting life. To me, really, it's an engagement with life. It's a willingness to engage with life exactly as life is presenting itself to you and to us at this moment. How do I meet this moment? How do I have compassion for myself for the things that I've been through? And how do I still recognize that this life, no one can walk the walk of my life but me. This life is mine to live. It is a particular set of challenges and blessings for each one of us, and challenges for each one of us to meet and to work through and to overcome. And so to me, if we use responsibility as a cudgel, as a way of beating people up, as a way of blaming people, we are missing the point. And likewise, if we basically abdicate responsibility and say, things are such a mess in my life, the experiences that I have been through are so horrific, so traumatic, so oppressive, so difficult, that I can't take responsibility for my life. Or even more insidious, the circumstances of your life have been so difficult that you can't be expected to take responsibility for your life. That's an abdication. That's a missing of an opportunity. That's a disengagement from the dynamic, constantly changing opportunities that every moment presents to us. We're not to blame for what has happened to us. Responsibility does not mean blame, in my view. That's a terrible distortion of it. We are not to blame. We are not to be faulted. We are not to have even our most foolish decisions held over our head and used against us. At the same time, no one can live our lives but us. The responsibility, the best sense of the word to me is, what can I do? How can I be right here, given everything that has happened to me? How can I take responsibility for learning what I need to learn? How can I take responsibility for healing what I need to heal? How can I take responsibility for the details and the circumstances in my life that first work for me and then make me a contributing member of my family, of my relationships, of my community, and my life. So what I'm suggesting is that we reclaim the true, what I see as the true meaning of responsibility, as the engagement and the responsiveness and the willingness to live and express and learn from and act in our lives exactly as our lives are. Think of the great people who have overcome tremendous odds and tremendous challenges, oppression, violence, you name it, to become extraordinary beings. Would we want to take away their sovereignty, their responsibility by turning them into victims? Or would we want to encourage all of us, each of us, to take that responsibility, that power, that sovereignty, that opportunity for ourselves, and to live it to its fullest potential? Thank you for listening.